John Pavlovitz is a writer, pastor, and activist from Wake Forest, North Carolina. A 25-year veteran in the trenches of local church ministry, John is committed to equality, diversity, and justice, both inside and outside faith communities. When not actively working for a more compassionate planet, John enjoys spending time with his family, exercising, cooking, and having time in nature. He is the author of A Bigger Table, Hope and Other Superpowers, Low, and Stuff That Needs to Be Said. And then we have his latest book that we're going to be talking about today, which I just posted on my Facebook page. Pulling back up the title. If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk. That's what we're going to be talking about this morning, along with his other work. So I tell you what, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Reading Circle microphone, Pastor John Pavlovitz. So, John, good morning again.
Good morning. It's really great to be with you, Mark. Thank you so much.
It is great to be with you. Where are you calling out of?
I am in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Raleigh. I have family down there. Matter of fact, my aunt who is listening in Sunset Beach, she was just in that Raleigh area because I have cousins in there as well. So, all right, then. All right, at least you're on the East Coast because I have guests sometime that call in from the West Coast that are 3 hours behind. So at least it's 7 o'clock where you are also.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's kind of roll the tape back a little bit in terms of kind of like where did this all begin?
Well, my sort of this part of my career ministry life happened really about a decade ago. You know, I think I don't know how far back you'd like me to start, but I was serving in large church in the South, in the Charlotte area, and was really feeling some tensions as a minister between some of the things I was seeing in the church and kind of wasn't sure how much I could say. I was sort of softening my language, and I was talking around issues that I cared about because I didn't want to offend some of the church people. And gradually, I came to the point where I could no longer compromise. I knew that I needed to speak specifically into these issues, and that created a turbulence for me in my setting. And eventually, you know, I was in a church in Raleigh, and I always say I heard God call me to leave that church, and it came in the form of my pastor's voice saying, "You're fired," because there was just that some of the things I was saying on issues of race and sexuality and diversity, they didn't want. It was uncomfortable for them, and so that set me on a path of being in this larger space with a different kind of virtual congregation. And I've been writing and speaking for really the last 7 or 8 years now.
Was it your intent at some point? I mean, okay. In terms of being an author and writer and now pastor, I mean, what kind of like as a youngster are you where you thought you were going to be, or what you wanted to be whenever you were? Because, you know, we always ask kids that question: what do you want to be when you grow up? Or, you know, is this what you wanted to be when you grew up?
This was not in the plan at all. I grew up wanting to be an artist, and my training was in art, and I went to college in Philadelphia for graphic design and illustration, and really that's where everything changed for me, Mark, because having been raised in central New York in really a supportive but very insular, sheltered environment, when I got to Philadelphia for college, my world expanded because I was thrust into this diversity that I'd never seen and saw poverty that I'd never experienced, and those things changed me. And I worked in the art field for, you know, about 10 years really as an art director, and then was sort of drafted into church ministry, I say. I started volunteering for a local church, and my faith was really, I had been raised Roman Catholic and then had drifted from that faith in college, but found myself back at this little small church where my wife and I were married 25 years ago. And that's where everything changed. That's where I started volunteering, working with teenagers, and found that I had an affinity for, you know, that turbulent time of adolescence. I could speak into that. And then my faith began to grow. And then I started moving into slowly to the point where I left my full-time career to minister. And that's where I began about 25 years ago. So this was not the plan at all by any means.
Well, that's interesting because God has a way of changing plans, and I'm a witness to that in terms of I'm in the midst of a change right here at this moment and just never know which way it's going to go, but it's in God's hands. He has a way of doing that, and it's interesting, even in the beginning, whenever I ask you, what do you want to be called? You say, well, I'm a human being, and that's at the end of the day what we all are. But what's interesting is kind of like the premise and what you've been talking about is how human beings treat other human beings. And the listening audience, they are bored of me sharing each week that when I'm not doing radio, I'm the principal of a school. And I had this conversation with our guidance counselor yesterday about how in a dark place we are in terms of how human treat other humans. And we're seeing it even at a very young age, like 9 and 10-year-olds, just how they have no regard for their fellow human beings. And you ask them, well, would you like what you did to him to have been done to you? They'll tell you no. Then why would you do that knowing you wouldn't want that done to you? So it's interesting that as I look in the subtitle of your book about humans, a faith that makes us better humans. If there ever was a time that we need something to make us all better humans, it's now.
Yeah, Mark, I think, one of the hearts of the book is the idea that all our theology is ultimately relational, that it's about what people experience when they meet us and when they live alongside us in relationship or they pass us on the street. What could they tell our beliefs from the way, could we retrofit that? Could we look at the way that we treat them and tell us what we actually believe? We often like to, on our Facebook pages, Twitter pages, we in conversation, we like to say what we are, that we're Christian or what we believe. But is that what people experience when they meet us? And that's one of the real tests, I think, of a faith that becomes tangible.
Absolutely right. And that's what I say. I am convinced, one, that we are in spiritual warfare. And I even just put on Facebook that, you can't fight spiritual warfare using the tactics from physical warfare. And going back to this whole, and that's what intrigues me about this whole thing of just, for me, I get it on the one hand, but on the other hand, I don't. It's just, as a human, knowing that's another human, how do you treat him or her in that manner? And I think you just hit on something like, can people tell what you profess or what you say you believe based on how you treat them?
Yeah, we all, you'll be passing, you'll be behind a car on the highway, and there's a bumper sticker that says, "How's my driving?" with a number. And often, we want to call that number and say, "You're not driving really well." And I think that's a question that I always want to ask. I want to ask people, how are they encountering me? And then that's also, I think, something that in a larger sense, Christians don't necessarily do that well, especially to marginalized, vulnerable, oppressed communities. We don't say, "Do you feel loved by us?" We assume that we're being loving because that's the mission statement of the church.
Excellent point. And see, this gets into self-reflection, and that's what, self-admittedly, folks really do not want to do is to reflect upon themselves. And a lot of times, again, and in my industry, a lot of times we will do 360 evaluations where, because this is the thing about us as humans too. Like you just said, we think because of the mission or we think because of how we see ourselves that everybody else sees us like that. When the truth of the matter is the way we see ourselves may not be how others see us. So it really is important to get some feedback. I say all the time in terms of, I always use the story of David with Nathan, because biblically, there are just stories to me, and there's the messages in there, no question, they are significant messages, but I have this humorous mind in terms of whenever I'm reading through a lot of these things, I kind of see them either talking from a street perspective, or if I was talking from it, rather than the Bible-ese, I'll put it in as, I guess they can call it ebonics or in slang or whatever you want to put it to get the message across. But it's in that scenario with David, Nathan came to him and put that scenario to him, and David got an attitude. Like, that person, he should be off with his head. He ought to be done away with. And then Nathan turns around and says, "Yo, man, that's you." So that's what I'm saying. It's for us in terms of self-reflection and others being able to say, well, I know that's what you think. You think you all that in a bag of chips, but this is how we receiving you. I couldn't agree with you more.
I think there's always a story that we tell ourselves about who we are, what we care about, and how we're living. And we do a lot to make sure that story stays true in our heads. And often when we have to face honest criticism or we're in, authentic relationships with people, we find out things that sort of derail that. And when we have to confront that, that's the difficult part. Are we going to choose to lean into those observations and grow from them, or are we going to become hardened and arrogant in our faith? And I think that happens a lot, especially in the church. We become calloused, and we believe that anyone else's criticism is somehow about them, when actually we might want to take some of what they're saying and ask if there's wisdom there. Because I think a faith that is real is constantly testing who we are. It's constantly evaluating, am I the person that I think I am?
Correct. It's interesting because my pastor, he says it jokingly or facetiously, but there's a message in that. And when he said, when somebody comes to him and says, Pastor, you sure told them. So, okay, so you didn't get anything out of it. It was everybody else but you. You sure told them this morning, Pastor.
Well, as a minister, I've had those Sundays where I walked off the platform or finished services, and 10 minutes later, my wife is saying, "Didn't you just preach about this?" And I would say, "Well, that was for them. That was for the people, and that was not for me." But the truth is, we all have a very self-reverential picture of ourselves. We often imagine the best of ourselves in a negative fashion when it comes to the way we live our values. And so I think the book and my work is always about constantly doing those self-evaluations and doing that in community as well. I mean, that's a huge part of it, is having a community of people around you who respect you enough and where they can be honest with you. And that's often something that's difficult right now, to have true, authentic relationships.
You're absolutely right. I had a situation the other day because I admit, and I don't get angry often. I don't blow often, but when I do blow, it blows. Folks know. Let's put it that way. So I had a situation the other day with one of our employees, and first off, she caught me totally off guard with what she was doing. So it was one of those where I'm trying to work on, respond rather than react. I'm trying to work on responding, I have to make sure I don't flip them around. But it's the response versus the reaction. So she actually caught my reaction because I was like, "What are you doing?" And then it just got into me ultimately, which is something is really I don't believe in, but it just one of those that just came out, yelling or reprimanding somebody in front of an audience. That's what the situation I got into, and it just totally tore her apart. And she checked me on it. She did. We had a wonderful conversation. I apologized, and we actually now became, better because of it. But she was willing to check me on it. And the next day, we when all minds and was calmer, we had a wonderful conversation, and we got into things I had no idea that was going on in her life, and so forth and so on, as to why she fell apart whenever I reprimanded her in front of 2 or 3 other people. And so we do that. And the other piece of that is, particularly because we're talking the church community, the Christian community, we sing Just As I Am, and we tell folks, come as you are. And when they come into church and they do that, then we get to judging.
That's right. Because that's one of the things I talk about in the book a lot, that the idea of loving our neighbor is something I think we all embrace. But then we have our actual neighbor in front of us, and they may have characteristics or beliefs or be part of things that we disagree with. And how do we respond in those moments? How do we respond to that specific neighbor? And is that something that we could stand on? Is that something we could be proud of? And often we don't want to know what that answer is.
No, that's true. And I had this comment, and she's going to hate me for sharing this, but I'm going to share it anyway. I had this conversation with my mom the other day. So my mom lives down in Georgia, and she was telling me about some folks that came in the church and hadn't been, and they come every now and again. They don't come enough, and so forth and so on. And when she do come, she's like this, that, and that. And I said, "Mom, are you listening to what you're saying? are you listening to what you're saying? On the one hand, you said they don't ever come, and now whenever she did come, you told me, and she came in and she was like this. I said, Mom, you're judging. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. Because how do you expect her to keep coming back when you're coming at her as if to say, well, you're here, but look how you came?
Right. I think in the business world, they would talk about, in the company, they would talk about mission drift. They would say, we have to evaluate our company, our organization, to make sure we're still embodying the ideals that we started with, because over time you can gradually shift to the point where you're quite far away. And I think as believers, as people of faith and morality and conscience, and we need to do that often, is just look at whatever the heart of our belief system is and say, am I still perpetuating that? Is that still something that is part of the DNA of my life?
So in terms of now, this is your latest book. What was your first book?
My first book was called A Bigger Table, and that was pretty much the story, my formative journey growing up in the church, the idea, the God story that I grew up in, the family story that I grew up in, and then, coming to Philadelphia, as I mentioned, and my world expanding. And then 10 years later, when I entered ministry, when I was surprised by ministry and found myself in the role of being a teacher, a pastor, a leader, I wanted to be that same person that I was in Philadelphia, with this really expansive, disparate community around me and being really open. But what I found was gradually the church shrunk my table. And so the church had made my life smaller because I was only around Christians and only around Christians in my church. And I wanted to have a ministry that reflected a wider swath of people. I wanted to be living in that world, and began sort of pushing against the things in church that were rigid or that hampered diversity.
Absolutely. Because see, again, and I have to think of the author now who, the name escapes, it'll come to me at some point, that actually did the same. And it might have been in novel form. I'm not sure. I have so many books I have to go back. But that's exactly what was going on in the storyline of challenging some of the traditions in order to widen the net or the audience. And I'll have to go back to figure out which book it was. But that's exactly what the pastor in that particular story was doing. And he wound up being ostracized and kicked out of the church and so forth and so on. But at the end of the day, if we say we want all to come to Christ, then we want all. And we can put up barriers and fences, like I just gave you the example with my mom, that will actually turn people away.
That's so true, Mark. And part of it is because I think the nature of any kind of community, but spiritual community, once you're in that thing, it's very inviting, and it's very encouraging, and it's a fierce love that you're part of. And I think what that can often do is make us beholden to that community, so that we don't want to speak into it. We don't want to create conflict or turbulence. And so often we soften our beliefs, or we bring partially edited versions of ourselves where we're not completely honest, because we say, if I share this, that will ingratiate me in the community. But if I share this, well, that might push me to the periphery. And so I think the beautiful part of community often eventually becomes a stumbling block for us, because we want to stay in that circle so badly that we'll never deviate. And I think what we need right now are people of faith who can say, maybe this isn't the best way to treat people, or maybe there is a better way to express love, and that's what our job should be.
And the thing is, for those of you who have no idea of the community that John and I are talking about in terms of the Christian community or in the faith or what have you, as we call, for those who are not, we call them out in the world. What we in the Christian community and the faith need to understand is the world is accustomed to what the world knows. They may or may not be what we now in the faith or Christians or believers or whatever. So when they do come in, they're going to bring in what their experiences are. It is now up to us to understand that and say, all right, for right now, fine, come on in and do what you do. And the longer you're here, the more you begin to learn, and you'll start becoming a part of, as they say, the way, if you will. But what we do is, like I said, we go back to the song, Just As I Am and Come As You Are, and so forth and so on. What we do is, when they bring in what the only thing they know, we slam them at that point. And they're like, well, if that's the case, I'm not coming back. And I'll give you an example. Again, it's another one from my pastor, that he was in a situation, or a friend of his, another pastor friend, was in a situation where the family came in. It was a new family, and they came in, and, the pastor's in the middle of his sermon, and all of a sudden he sees the mother go into her pocketbook and break out, for the most part, a full-course meal. And she starts passing the food to the kids and everything. They're sitting there in the church while church is going on. They start passing the food, this, that, and the other. So members in the church started getting really upset. And the pastor was like, he just kept on going with his sermon. And, at the end, folks came to him saying, why didn't you stop them? Why didn't you say why? And he had to explain, well, first off, they're new. They may not be accustomed to what goes on in a church. Maybe that's something they do with the movies or wherever they're at. If you now jump on them for doing that, they're not coming back.
Right. Well, and I think, Mark, that the power of a deep spirituality, the beauty of it is that I think it should have you in a posture of curiosity about people, that you want to step into their lives and learn their stories. And when you respect each person that you meet as this complex and fully formed story, and you want to learn about that, then it's going to make you softer toward them. And so that empathy is such a crucial part of not only being a person of faith, but just as the subtitle of the book says, being a better human. And that empathy, I think, is at the core of what we should reclaim and we need to hold on to, because it makes us aware that people don't step into our lives as a caricature or as a stereotype. They step into our lives as a complex, once in history, never to be repeated story, and we need to respect that.
Absolutely. I mean, again, as we're along these same lines, another story again, and a lot of the stories I get is shared with me, from my church experience or with my pastor, whatever. But again, he gives another example, very similar, where it was brothers off the street, thugs off the street that came into the service. And, again, come as you are, just as I am. They came in there. So now as the preacher is preaching, where we normally say amen or hallelujah or go ahead or whatever we say, they were saying preach MF or preach. They were saying the whole word. They weren't just saying the letters. They were saying preach MF or preach. Again, the church members became extremely rankled, and the pastor didn't. And he says, well, again, that's what they know based on where they've been. So again, it might be at one of their rallies or one of their events or whatever, that's how they respond. They thought that's the same way you responded. Now, that's not to say somebody, once they begin coming and consistent, that they don't change. Because it's kind of like going back to the fisherman story. All right, you know what? We catch the fish, God will clean them.
Mm-hmm. And, well, Mark, it's one of the things that I think is interesting. It can happen in really subtle ways, too. In my story, when I was an art director and my then fiance and I had met and moved to a new area, and we were looking for a church, we were feeling pulled back to spiritual community. We had both drifted from organized religion, and we were looking for a place to get married. And so I did something very spiritual. I got out the yellow pages at the time and started calling all these local churches. And many of them would said, well, we can't marry you because you haven't been a member here for a certain amount of time, or you need to take a long class or whatever it could be. And we were running into these roadblocks. And then one little country Methodist church, a female pastor, she reached out to us and she said, well, why don't you come down to our community and spend a Sunday with us and see how you feel? And then we'll talk about, you and your relationship and your plans. And we walked into that little church and everything changed, because it embodied so many of the things that we had been missing in the religion of our youth. And then we were married at that church, started volunteering, and the complete path of my life changed. And I now, having reached millions and millions of people through this work, that doesn't happen if that pastor isn't there to say, well, yeah, there are rules, but let's just treat these two people as human beings and welcome them. And that's what did it for me.
Because see, I am, all right, folks, there's two different types of law. There's letter of the law and spirit of the law. I can tell you, and anybody that's ever worked with me, they will tell you, yeah, he's spirit of the law. Exactly what John just said. Yeah, we understand the rules, but okay, you know what? So, because you just, at the end of the day, going back to the human, at the end of the day, everybody wants to be embraced. Everybody wants to be loved. When it's all said and done, regardless of whatever folks do or don't do, it's all based on the fact that everybody desires to be loved, acknowledged, accepted, embraced. At the end of the day, it comes down to that. Matter of fact, for folks, if you've just joined me, my guest this morning is Pastor John Pavlovitz. We're talking about his work. His latest book is If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk. Finding a faith that makes us better humans. And I'm right here on the website, so I'm reading from there. It says, faith shouldn't make you a jerk. John's compassion, humanity, humility, and humor are present throughout. His candor is authentic and his inspiration accessible and also challenging in the very best sense. And that was written by Chelsea Clinton, author and advocate. It says, if God is love, don't be a jerk. Thou shalt not be horrible. Imagine for a moment what the world might look like if we, as people of faith, morality, and conscience, aspired to this mantra. What if we were fully burdened to create a world that was more loving and equitable than when we arrived? What if we invited one another to share in wide open, fearless spiritual communities truly marked by compassion and interdependence? In If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk, John Pavlovitz examines the bedrock ideas of our religion, the existence of hell, the utility of prayer, the way we treat LGBTQ people, the value of anger, and other doctrines to help all of us take a good, honest look at how the beliefs we hold can shape our relationships with God and our fellow humans, and to make sure that love, I love it, has the last, loudest word. And that's what I was just saying. At the end of the day, that's all every human on the planet is seeking is love.
Yes. I can remember being in a ministry setting at a student gathering for the mega church where I was serving hundreds of students and their families. And I tell the story in the book of looking around the room and seeing all these people, but then looking at two students who are on the edge of the room, at the on the periphery of the room, and they looked uncomfortable. And I remember going up to them and having a conversation with them and trying to welcome them and doing all the things that pastors do to invite people in, and wasn't getting a response. Really felt like I was failing miserably. And a couple of days later, got an email from the older of the two students, who was the sister, and she told me this story. And she said, you may not remember us, but we were there. We didn't want to be there because we'd had really bad experiences with churches and pastors, but our parents forced us to go. And she said, but you came up and you seemed to really care. And then she said, you made me feel visible, and I rarely feel visible.
Wow.
And I think that is the heart of not only what I've tried to do since then, but also, as someone who was raised in the Christian tradition, that is what Jesus does. He has these eyes that see the human being. And it says in Matthew chapter 9, when he looked at the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he looks at what the world is doing to them, not what they're doing. He's looking at their internal condition. And that's, I think, important for all of us to look around and say, how can we make people feel seen and heard and loved?
Absolutely. I could not agree with you more. I mean, I'm in like a zillion % agreement with you. As a matter of fact, I'm still on your site, and I love this quote you have on there. It says, I like you. You're a Christian, but you're not a jerk. And that's interesting because I don't know if you're familiar, but there was a sitcom back in the 70s, Sanford and Son.
Oh, sure.
And in Sanford and Son, then you would know there was Aunt Esther. Aunt Esther was supposed to be the Christian in there, and all she did was beat folks over the head with the Bible. And I think in many instances, a lot of folks out in the quote-unquote world see us as Aunt Esther. They literally start running from, oh, Lord, here he come again. Oh, Lord, here she come again. Oh, no, I don't want to hear that.
Well, they see that individually in us, and then they see collectively often what people say to me. And I'm fortunate, Mark, because I have this really disparate community that has no barriers of building or denomination or tradition, and so they just come to the writing in whatever way they do. And if it resonates with them, then they feel a part of this larger community with people who may be of faith and people who are not. And what they do is they say to me, why are so many Christians so hateful, or why are so many Christians so exclusionary? Because they're looking at the religion that tends to make the news and have the microphone, and they're not seeing these small communities or these interfaith partnerships or these ministries that are serving people. They're seeing, I think, the worst expression of religion. And I think part of what it's incumbent upon us as people of faith is to make sure people know that there is an alternative spirituality that we are living out.
And see, I'm in full total agreement with you. And I was saying before you came on the air, in any organization that I have led, I always start off when I meet the staff for the first time, letting them know there is no such thing in here as a justa, Justa. In other words, I don't want the custodian to feel any less than I feel as the principal. I don't want the security guard or the secretary or the food services person or the cafeteria monitor or whatever position or title you have, because every one of them is important. And yet you have people who snub their nose or look down on people based on what their job title is. They will also do the same thing when we go beyond that in terms of race or gender or sexuality or whatever. Folks do the same thing. And if we go back to our statement of, at the end of the day, every human being on the planet wants to be loved, the fact that you become exclusionary, or either you start looking your nose down upon because of or whatever, that's where the issues keep coming in. That's why I love what your book and your work is about.
I think there's a fear that is leveraged in the worst of religion and the worst of politics that presses into the prejudices and the biases, and it takes that fear and it makes people terrified of other people. And I think when we begin to remove that fear, then we replace that with empathy, when we understand that we're not in competition with one another, that we are an interdependent community. When we can really see people, when their well-being is tied to ours, I think in so many contexts that is the better path. And that's what I'm constantly asking people to try and consider, that we are collaborative with others and not competitive with them.
No, it really is. And again, over the last few years, I think we have gotten more fractionated and divided and divisive and hateful of each other than ever, because a lot of it was just a spirit of hate that was at the helm. And it really, we haven't even gotten out of that jet wash yet. We're still in it. But we are more, and hopefully we'll begin to recover, but we seem to be more divided now than we've been in a very long time. And again, that's why work and the message that you're trying to get across is that much more important.
We all have a story that we tell ourselves, and I think one of the things that, social media is wonderful. It helps connect us and keep us more informed than we might have been 20 or 30 years ago. We have more news options available, and that's a good thing. But what it also can do is it can artificially enlarge the bad news. It can take the worst stories and it can show them to us all day long, and to the point where we believe that is the story. But there is always an alternative news feed, in our local communities, in your school, in your workplace, in your neighborhood, where you see these beautiful acts continuing to happen, and you see good things rising up all around you. And it's remembering that there is that alternative story and that we can be a part of that.
You know what? That's a very good point, because when all is said and done, and you're right, especially when you get to the granular level, you do get an opportunity to see humans at their best. And it's kind of like if you go back to the Anne Frank story, where Anne Frank always, no matter what was going on, always said, at the end of the day, humans are good. That even though she was being persecuted back with the whole Holocaust situation, she still was saying humans are good.
I think, and that is it, Mark, the heart of what we believe. Everyone believes they aspire to goodness. Rarely do people intentionally act cruelly or intentionally discriminate. Those things are usually a symptom of something else. And I think most people tell themselves a story that they are a good human being. And so that's why that self-reflection, that's why community, That's why really asking hard questions of ourselves matters.
No, you're right. And now, because I keep hearing you use the word empathy, and that's a perfect word. And based on what you just said in terms of sometimes, I mean, you have folks actually for extenuating circumstances who can't feel empathy or don't have empathy.
That's the challenge. I think in my story, the teachings of Jesus, I found that compassion to be the heart of what his life was, and yet you can't argue someone into compassion. You can't preach them into compassion. You can't force them to care about another human being. The only thing you can do is give them experience of other people's stories and allow those stories to connect to theirs and have that change happen slowly, which is what happened to me. I didn't wake up with a set of beliefs that suddenly switched. I just had life begin to argue with my theology, and then I had to ask myself, where was the wisdom there? And so it's in meeting more people and getting better stories about people that compassion, those muscles began to figure out how to be used.
Now, I was going to ask you where did the title come from, but I think we kind of, I mean, I'm still going to ask the question, but I think I kind of got it out of that quote that was saying, hey, you're a Christian, but you don't seem to be a jerk. I mean, is that kind of like where the title came from?
Well, the title was an effort to bring a little bit of lightness and humor to something that's really a really sad idea, right? That there are so many people, professed people of faith, living lives that aren't marked by love. And I think, you say correctly that we have had sort of this hatred at the helm, and we've had this from the top down saturation of cruelty and enmity. And someone said to me, why didn't you just call the book, If God is Love, Then Love People? But I said, well, my aspirations for humanity have gotten a little more pedestrian. I just want us to not be harmful. Could we start there? Could we start in that place of let's just try not to hurt others, and then we'll move to the place where we can actually fully love people. So the not be a jerk part is really saying, try not to harm as best you can, and then when you find that you are harming others, ask yourself if that is really the path that you want to be on.
Excellent point. Do no harm. And that's what I was trying to deal with this 9-year-old yesterday that maliciously did something that he knew. He told me it was inappropriate. And I asked him, and you knew when you were doing that it was inappropriate, and yet you still did it? And he says, yes. I said, what did you expect to come out of that? He said, something bad. I said, okay, I had to rewind again. I said, so were you expecting something bad to come out of it, but you did it anyway? And it was against one of his other classmates. And he says, yes. And so, again, this is where the conversation between, whenever we let them out of my office, me and the guidance counselor was just talking like, what is going on here in terms of someone that young that could do something knowingly, that malicious, knowing the outcome of it, and still was willing to do it anyway. In other words, we're talking about do no harm. This kid knew that what he was doing was going to do harm.
Mm. Well, sometimes, Mark, in the work that I do, I'm talking to people who are 4 or 5 decades down the road from that 9-year-old, and they're still living that way. And even in the context of being a lawmaker or a pastoral leader, and I'm continually trying to ask these people, you can't condemn, you can't tell someone what their motives are. You can't say you're intending to hurt, you're intending to be cruel. You can't really make that judgment. But what you can say to someone is, I want you to see the effects of your life or your words or your belief system or your legislation on other human beings. And then you let their humanity have a chance to work. So those stories are so important to continually confront people with what it's like to live on the other side of your life.
And see, what you just said about being decades away is exactly what our conversation was in terms of being fearful that if something doesn't intervene, by the time this kid is 10, 20 years down the line, he's going to be hurting some grown-ups. And so, we got to his mother, we met with his mother, and we're big on, having the kids meet with some type of a therapist or something, especially whenever we see it like at this stage of the game. Because if he's doing this now, then there's no telling if something or someone doesn't, or either like what you just described, like someone modeling or putting the situation in a way that they get a chance to reflect and say, well, you know what, that wasn't the best thing to do. Next time I won't do that. That's our fear, that kid will now be the one decades later that's the terror.
Yes. And life is about the patterns that we develop, whether it's our physical health, whether it's our emotional health, whether it's our spiritual journeys. And I think when you begin to have something like a behavior like that, it becomes more difficult to jettison that. It becomes much more a natural part. The cruelty might not occur to you down the road. You might become so defensive in protecting your story that you become an adult who is not able to be reasoned with even those very sensible, conversations.
So in terms of, as we're talking here, and I saw the word as I was reading through your webpage as well, in terms of being progressive, how much or has progressive gotten in the way? Because we were talking about kind of, going in the face or not necessarily bucking tradition, but kind of like trying to expand it. Has that, how much has an impact that have had on you in terms of being in the Christian community?
Well, as I said earlier, in the particular congregation where I was, I had been in a church, for 10 years and had an equity of trust built up with people, had relational capital, and I could nudge the community in certain issues. I could maybe make us more aware of some of our biases and some of the privilege that was running through our community. But when I arrived at a new community and didn't have that equity of trust, well, then I didn't, the leeway that I had in the other community, I didn't have, and that's where the turbulence came. And so that particular community, I found myself outside of. But what that did was it gave me a pause, and for the first time in 17 years, I was no longer the pastor of a local church. I woke up on a Sunday and had no church community to oversee and to shepherd and to live alongside. And that grieved me, but then it also quickly told me that, but now I have something I didn't have before. My only responsibility right now is to represent my own faith convictions and not the convictions of hundreds or thousands of other people. And I asked myself, what do I actually believe and how do I really want to live? And if I'm going to go back to the church as a minister, what's that going to look like now, knowing what I know? And that's when I decided I was going to be fully authentic and I was going to wrestle with these questions publicly. And those who were comfortable with that, they would be part of that congregation. And that's the beautiful part of this work.
Well, see, this is the thing, and you brought it up earlier about with Jesus, because this is where they would always try to catch Jesus up in, was the fact that he would always hang out with the biggest sinners. He was always with the tax collectors, he was with the adulterers, he was with the fornicators, he was with the folks that was doing this, that, and the other, and they would always kind of like, well, we don't quite understand this. You're the, the king, the creator, the savior, this and that, but you always go to the ones that's doing the worst things. And not only do you go to them, you don't go there and judge them. You don't go there and condemn them per se. You kind of like hang out with them and try to show them how to be better.
Well, and it's never written about a lot in the scriptures explicitly, but I've always looked at that idea of the religious leaders saying, look, he eats with the prostitutes and the sinners. And I could also imagine that the people of the street were saying, look at him, he eats with the Pharisees or he's with the Roman soldier. So I think there was probably that push and pull both ways with a group of people, saying, why are you with the immoral? But another group saying, why are you with our oppressors? And I think that's a spot that people of faith, morality, and conscience, when we're trying to form a better world, we're in that tension between people who have a seat at the table and people who do not. And there's always going to be a certain amount of friction there, and we have to be willing to stand in it and be as honest as we can.
That's an excellent point. Until you just said that, I never thought about the possibility of the other side saying, well, he's with the Pharisees and so forth and so on. Never thought of it, never looked at it from that perspective, that they might have been saying the same thing from the opposite end. In the poem If, there's a stanza in that says, if you can walk with kings and not lose the common touch. And I'm paraphrasing the line, but it's kind of like, if all men count with you, but none too much. If you can kind of, what is it? If you can walk with kings and not lose your virtue, and so forth and so on, it's kind of like being able to navigate in both worlds. To be able to, and you don't, neither one of them, you're not going to, fawn and fall over, but both of them matter you to a degree, but not to the point where you put one over the other. I guess that's what it's trying to get to.
Yeah. I can remember being at a evangelist event, very well-known evangelist, speaking to thousands of people, and I'm on the platform watching him speak with, clarity and passion and confidence, but then realizing as he's speaking that he really doesn't know any more than the people he's speaking to or me. We all have the same incompletes, and we all do our best to find the wisdom. But ultimately, there is a mystery and a wonder that we all have. There's information that we just don't have, and in a beautiful way that really equalized everyone and made me conscious of the fact that the evangelist and the person that they're preaching to are really in the same condition. They're imperfect people who are doing the best they can, living an experience they've never had, and that's what we're all doing. And so we need to just, I think, be sensitive to that and be a little gentler toward people.
Absolutely. And this is the exact line in the poem. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you but none too much. And that's where this, because now you being a public speaker, you're traveling the world, you get a chance to work in the various services or seminars or what have you. And I've done public speaking as well. And what I found is that, during the breaks or the lunch, the folks who are in the audience or in the congregation, they absolutely lose their minds if the presenter takes time with them. Going back to what we were saying earlier about being acknowledged and loved. I've been in sessions where I've been the instructor or the teacher, and at lunchtime I'll go sit at a table with folks that are in the class. And it is amazing how they were like just, oh my God, this instructor sat at our table. He ate lunch with us. So forth and so on. That's a big deal for folks. So I can only imagine now what we were saying a couple minutes ago when the quote unquote sinners, if you will, we're all sinners, but the sinners, Jesus was at my house. Jesus stopped by and he ate with us. And it's kind of like, and like I said, I never thought about it from the perspective of what you just said, them looking the other way, saying, wow, he was up there with the Pharisees. But that is where, at the end of the day, going back to what I said early on, the little joke about Pastor, you sure told them. At the end of the day, when we're preaching or we're teaching, whatever, we ought to be preaching and teaching to ourselves as well. God ought to be speaking to us as he's using us for the words to come through us.
I think that's so true. There needs to be a constant humility in our lives that asks the question, what can I learn from this experience, or are those words for me? We're always thinking, like you said, of the people, oh, this message would be great for whoever who's not sitting here. And that what that does is it takes the energy and the focus away from saying, well, what's in this for me? What is the lesson that I have to learn? And that, I think, humility, whether we're a religious person or not, that's a difficult posture to retain. The constant curiosity about other people and the idea that I may be wrong in this situation is something that's really difficult to embrace as well.
Absolutely. Well, I tell you what, what's next? What's next on the horizon? Because, it's like, are any of the books, and I tend to ask this question, there's a few questions I tend to ask every interview because I don't work off a question list. It really is based on the conversation. Are any of the books your favorite, or are they all serve a different purpose? Or are they all, kind of like, is anyone your favorite?
I think they're all, what they are is honest expressions of who I was at the time, and they were written, and some of them are written in conditions that were easier and some more difficult, so they're always, I think, informed by that. But the most recent book is my favorite because of how difficult it was to write. I started writing in January of 2020, And in the year that began to unfold, and the wrestling I did with how much of the story of the pandemic and the high-profile murders of black people and the Black Lives Matter protests and counter-protests, and then the approaching election, how much of that I was going to pull in. And I really pivoted and decided I was going to speak as clearly as I could in real time about these things that were happening, about all this exclusion and hatred, and it seemed to be coming from so many people who were professing faith and confronting the whys of that. And so it was a laborious, difficult, challenging book to write, and because of that, I think there's an honesty in it that I'm just really pleased with. I can look at this and say, this is the best I could express this as I'm able to right now. So I'm really, really happy with it.
Another interesting point you brought up just now in terms of the positions and stances taken on by the Christian community, depending on what was going on. And what brought back to mind was a few weeks ago, I taught a deacons class. I taught a class for deacons, and a part of the class was the whole notion of the role that women are playing now in ministry. And there are a lot of folks still stuck in the gender thing. Yep. And the point was being made was, well, wait a minute. This is the same community that whenever we were talking race was fighting, to end racism, but yet now you're now in a position that you're not fighting for the sexism. In other words, you're upholding the sexist view in terms of only males can minister, but it's the same group that was now fighting back in the civil rights movement and these other movements whenever it was racism. So they say you can't have it both ways. You can't sit there and defend one while trying to do away with the other, because it's the same issue. You're still putting down somebody based on their race, their gender, ethnicity, or whatever.
I think that's inherent in that's our humanity. We always want to, I think when we doubt our own goodness or we have insecurities, then we want to look at another group of people and say, well, we are at least better or superior than those. And we may not even explicitly say that in our heads, but we feel that. And I think we're always looking for a group of people who we can use as the outsiders or the less than good people. And that's a dangerous place. I think that's what Jesus did, was he came into these communities and said, you're all equally flawed and you're all equally beautiful. And that's what we should be doing.
There you go. I love that. You're all equally flawed and you're all equally beautiful. Wow, I might have to quote that on Facebook. I'll put your name under it, but we're all equal. I got to see if I can get a pen and paper and get that down. We're all equally flawed and we're all equally beautiful. Wow, that pretty much says it. I mean, I don't think you can get much better than that. I got to write this down because I want to get it. We are all, I'm getting ready to put it on Facebook in a few minutes, equally flawed, and we are all equally beautiful. I'm going to put that as a quote from our interview this morning. All right, so we're down to the point now where the last few minutes, what I do is I shut off my mic. I don't talk. I allow you to promote any book signings, where you're going to be, websites, telephone numbers, contact information, anything you'd like to promote, with the exception of a dollar amount. That's the only thing we can't mention on the air, is cost and price and all that kind of stuff. They can work that out when they get in touch with you if need be. But at this point, you can shout out, you can promote anything. If you want to promote your publicist, you want to promote anything you want to say to let the folks know how they can get in touch with you or more about you, I'm going to turn the mic off, and the mic is yours.
Well, my name is John Pavlovitz, and it's spelled Pavlovitz. There's not a lot of John Pavlovitzes in the world, so you'll probably find me. Once you can spell my name, you can find my website, johnpavlovitz.com. You could find me on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, and you can connect with me via all those platforms. And we just launched a site called empatheticpeople.com, and it's an alternative social media community where you can be away from trolls and bots and ads and hatred, and we're trying to build a compassionate community there.
Well, there's that song, What the World Needs Now is Love, Sweet Love. Well, I tell you what, if there ever was a time when the world needs love, sweet love, it is now. So I applaud the work you're doing in terms of getting that message out. And as my mom can always say, keep on keeping on.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. It's been a joy to be with you today.
Well, same here, and I will be in touch. What I do is I record the show. It goes up on my YouTube channel as an archive, so I will send you that as well as the MP3 link, and you are free to use them in any way you choose. They are yours once you receive them.
Great. Well, thank you again for your time.
Well, thank you for rising early with me as well. Have a wonderfully blessed day, weekend, week, and life.
You as well, my friend. Take care now.
Thank you. Take care as well.